I want to talk to you just a little bit about Genesis 1 and 2, and I want to ask the question, what is it that Moses was doing when he wrote Genesis 1 and 2? Now, most of the time, whenever we're communicating, we understand the distinction between what someone says and what they mean. You say, what do you mean by that? Well, think of a teenage boy sleeping late in his bed one morning. Dad walks into his room and says, the trash man's going to be here in 30 minutes. Now, what did Dad say? Well, he said, trash man's going to be there in just a little while. But what did he mean? Well, he's telling the young man to go take out the trash. We find that kind of distinction in communication all through the Bible, and we intuitively understand that distinction. For example, in John chapter 2, we have Jesus at the marriage supper of Cana. And what happens is they run out of wine, and Mary says to him, they have no wine. Now, what did she say? They have no wine. What did she mean? Well, Jesus understood very well what she meant because he said, woman, what has that to do with me? My time has not yet come. In other words, she was saying, do something about this. And in fact, he does alleviate the situation. So we understand what the text may say. We understand intuitively what the text may mean. But we also need to talk about what is the text doing. My wife and I like to watch British murder mysteries. Evidently, according to British murder mysteries, every fourth Englishman is a murderer. And so we were watching this one where the police detective was resentful towards his captain because he had been passed over for promotion. So he's very angry. And it just so happened that the police captain also was having an affair with his secretary. And so they have a scene where they're having the Christmas office party. Everybody is there, the secretaries, the staffs, the detectives, and the spouses. And so the captain and his secretary, they're talking to a group of people. The captain's wife is over at another group talking to them. And the resentful, angry detective goes over to the wife. And he talks to the wife for a little bit, and then he motions over towards the captain and the secretary where they're talking, and he says, it's remarkable how often those two have to work late at night. And then he walks away. Now, you can see the realization coming upon the face of the captain's wife. Now, what did he say? He said they work late a lot. What did he mean? They're having an affair. But what was he doing with his words? He was using his words as a weapon. He was getting revenge. He was getting even with his boss. And so anytime one looks, and literary critics will always look at a text and they will ask the questions, what is a text saying? What does it mean? And what is the author doing? And I'd like to just take a few minutes at some of the ideas that people have had about what Moses is doing. And I'm going to argue that what Moses is doing is something missiological. And so I'm going to give a missional interpretation or a missional approach to Genesis 1 and 2. So, let's look at the various ways that people have understood what Genesis 1 and 2 is and what's going on. There are those who approach Genesis as simply abstract theology. There are those who look upon Genesis 1 and 2 as something that simply is pristine, abstract, and it dropped out of the sky. Well, I can understand why they might see it that way, because we do believe that the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit. It is the inerrant Word of God, and it really does teach us eternal truths that we otherwise would not have other than by divine revelation. But one of the problems with this approach is that it does not really take into account the situation, the Sitz und Leben, the situation in which the author is writing, the context. And so almost all of the Bible's ad hoc. I mean, even the book of Romans is not a book of systematic theology. It's writing to a context, to a particular situation. So this view, as good as it is, doesn't do Genesis 1 and 2 justice. At the other end of the spectrum is the view of Genesis as appropriation. It's the polar opposite of position 1. This view would say that whoever the author of Genesis is, what they did is that they borrowed ancient Near Eastern text, various elements of the myths such as the Enuma Elish or the Gilgamesh epic, and that what you have is Genesis 1 and 2 is sort of a literary Frankenstein monster. It's just been stitched together very poorly. And so you have these two creation accounts that don't fit together very well. Well, what can we say about that? Well, I think we do need to recognize that the author of Genesis, and I do believe Moses is the author of the Pentateuch, the author is employing ancient Near Eastern terms, concepts, and ideas. But I think there is a very good reason for him doing that. One does not find very many Old Testament scholars across the theological spectrum. And I don't just mean evangelical Old Testament scholars. I mean even those in mainline and liberal that think that Genesis 1 and 2 is simply an appropriation of A&E text. They understand very well that what you have is a work of very precise literary genius. And so it isn't just something cobbled together, borrowed from other cultures. So it's not merely an appropriation. Well, then there are those who view Genesis as an accommodation. That it's simply presented to us in accommodated language. And John Calvin, in his commentary on Genesis, argues this very well, in which he points out that Genesis 1 and 2 is written for a common audience to be understood by everyone everywhere. And so Calvin gives the famous metaphor that Genesis 1 is much like a nurse talking to baby talk to a baby so that the baby would understand it. Well, I think that the doctrine and the principle of accommodation is a significant biblical truth. In fact, I would argue that the whole Bible, in a sense, is an accommodation. So we understand that that is an important principle. However, and unfortunately, there are many today who are using the idea of accommodation in what I would have to consider an illegitimate way, in that there's a big difference between saying that God has accommodated down to our level and another thing to say that God has accommodated error. And I think that that is an illegitimate use of the notion of accommodation. And let me just say, many of those who are arguing for accommodation today, one detects in them a rather significant chronological snobbery. Yes, it's true that the ancients did not have the technical and scientific resources that we have. But they were neither stupid nor naive. And so I think that we need to understand that, yes, there's accommodated language, but that is not merely what Moses is doing. And then there are those who view Genesis as polemic. And I think now they're getting closer to what Moses is doing in Genesis 1 and 2. Without a doubt, what we have as Moses presents the creation account, he is dismantling the worldview, and he is attacking the various deities that the Egyptians and the Canaanites and the Babylonians and the Sumerians all were worshiping. But he isn't simply mad at them. It isn't simply polemic. I think that this is an important step forward, but it doesn't quite get to what Moses is doing. No, what we find is that we need to understand Genesis as contextualization. Now, what is contextualization? If you ever deal with missionaries or missiologists, one of the things that they must do is that they have to think long and hard about what is proper contextualization. Think about the challenges facing a missionary whenever he or she is going to communicate the gospel to a people group who've never heard the gospel before. How does one communicate that? And so missiologists understand that whenever this kind of encounter is happening, you don't just have two horizons. You don't just have two worldviews at work. And many times, whenever we approach the Bible, we think, okay, there is the original context of the author, and then there is the context that I have as a modern reader. That's two. Missiologically speaking, we understand that there's actually three worldviews going on in Genesis 1 and 2. There's not only the worldview of Moses, and not only my worldview as a modern, but there is the worldview of Moses' original audience. And we need to understand that Moses' original audience thought like pagans, like polytheists, through and through. You say, well, I thought he wrote it to the children of Israel, to the Hebrews in the wilderness wanderings. Yes, they had spent 400 years in Egypt, and they were thoroughly marinated in polytheistic pagan thinking. If you'll notice, they're incurable idolaters. It seems to be. I mean, the moment Moses goes up on Mount Sinai, what do? They make a golden calf. And we find all the way through the Old Testament, up until the time of the Babylonian captivity, we find where Moses and the prophets are having to constantly deal with the fact that these are a people who don't think like Moses, and they certainly don't think like us. So, when a missiologist is looking at how do I talk to people who are thinking entirely wrong, how do I do contextualization effectively, there are three principles that they follow, and we can see this not only when Moses, here in Genesis 1 and 2, but when Paul is on Mars Hill, or when John in his gospel uses the Logos concept. This is something we find throughout the Bible, and missiologists emphasize this. And so what is good contextualization? Well, first, you allow that culture to ask the questions. Now, what do I mean by that? I mean, you have to, basically what missiologists mean when they say that is that you got to start where they're at. You got to meet them where they're at. And so you do allow that culture to ask the questions. Wherever they're at, that is where you're going to have to start. The second principle is you use their grammar. A missiologist would tell you that whenever you go into that culture, you don't just start off, with Romans Road and the four spiritual laws. You'll have to not only carefully exegete the text of the Bible, but you're going to have to carefully exegete the culture into whom you are speaking. And so what happens is you do use their grammar, their concepts, their ideas, their terms. You're going to speak their language. And so the first thing you do is you do allow their question. You start where they're at. Second, you do use their grammar, but your answer subverts their worldview. In other words, you meet them where they're at, you just don't leave them there. Your answer will overthrow their worldview and will bring about transformation. And that's what we see going on in Genesis 1 and 2. What we find is that Genesis should be understood missionally. And so Genesis 1, 2, and 3 should be understood as an evangelistic tract. It is a document speaking to people who speak. In fact, I would argue that Genesis was a smashing success. That it did such a good job of overthrowing the worldview of its original audience that you and I, on this side of Genesis, have a very difficult time even conceiving how they thought. But once we understand that, we have a much better understanding why it is that Moses uses the language, uses the terminology, and speaks in the way that he does in communicating to a people who are thinking like pagans, acting like pagans, living like pagans, and he is leading them away from that. So the next time that you are witnessing to someone, talking to someone about creation, and they bring up the objection that Genesis looks an awful lot and sounds an awful lot like many of the ancient Near Eastern documents. What you can say and what you should say is, yes, this is because Moses was a very good and effective missionary. Thank you very much.